Rector Sain, distinguished faculty, members of the university, families, friends, and above all, graduates of MEF University. It is a great honor to be here with you today. Graduates, congratulations. This day belongs to you and to the families, friends, teachers, and mentors who helped you arrive here. I would like to begin with a confession. I always knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. It just never worked out that way. That may sound like a strange qualification for giving a commencement address. After all, commencement speakers are supposed to stand here and tell you about purpose, vision, determination, and the importance of following your dreams. I certainly believe in all those things, but I have also learned that dreams have a way of changing. Plans have a way of failing. Doors we expected to open sometimes remain closed. And doors we never even noticed suddenly swing wide open. So today, I want to speak to you about something that I hope will be useful as you step into the next part of your lives. The future will not follow your plans. At least not exactly. But that is not a tragedy. It may be the best thing that ever happens to you, as it has been for me. The question is not whether your plans will change. They will. The question is whether your curiosity will survive the change, whether your capacity to learn, to adapt, to ask questions, to think with others, and to take ownership of your own learning will survive. That, I believe, is the real gift of an education. And it is why this university, with its commitment to active learning, is such a fitting place to have this conversation. I am here in part because of friendship. My friendship with your rector, Professor Mohammed Shahin, goes back nearly a decade. Again and again, our conversations have returned to the same question: how do we build universities around learning rather than teaching? I had the privilege of writing the foreword for 3 of the 5 books Rector Shahin has written about education and innovation at MEF. In those books, and in our conversations, I recognized a shared conviction. Education should belong to the learner. And that brings me back to the future that will not follow your plans. When the path ahead is no longer the one you imagined, what you need most is not a fixed map. It's the ability to learn and adapt. So today, I want to offer 3 lessons about that ability. 3 lessons I learned the hard way. 1 about plans, 1 about learning, and 1 about the future. There is, however, a small irony here. I spent much of my career trying to reduce lecturing in classrooms. And yet, I must confess, I love lecturing. So, graduates, thank you for giving me the opportunity to lecture one more time without having to feel guilty about it. You may take out your notebooks. There are only 3 lessons. And because I am, after all, a teacher, I will give you the short version first. Have a plan, but stay open to the unexpected. Never confuse being taught with learning. And finally, in the age of AI, your questions matter more than your answers. So let's get started with the first lesson. Have a plan, but stay open to the unexpected. My first love was astronomy. When I was about 7 years old, my grandfather gave me a book about astronomy. I opened it, and I fell in love with the heavens. I was captivated by the stars, the planets, the galaxy, the immensity of space and time. I knew then and there what I wanted to become, an astronomer. As you may have gathered from my bio, that plan didn't quite work out. At the age of 17, I enrolled at the University of Leiden, which at that time was one of the great places in the world to study astronomy. It took about 6 weeks for my romance with the heavens to unravel. The subject that had filled me with wonder as a child was suddenly hidden behind a wall of formalism. It was taught mechanically. It was buried in equations. Somehow, the questions that had drawn me to astronomy disappeared. Instead of wonder, I was given answers I did not yet understand. So, I adjusted my plan and switched to physics. I had been good at physics in high school. My father was a physicist. Surely physics would be better. It was not. Physics, too, was taught as though knowledge were something that could be poured from the mind of the professor into the notebooks of the students. Lecture after lecture, derivation after derivation, equation after equation. I became totally disillusioned. The problem was not astronomy. The problem was not physics. The problem was that I was expected to learn by passively listening. Better lectures would not have saved me. What saved me was doing physics. Seeing my disillusionment, my father suggested that I join a research group. And there, for the first time, I experienced physics not as something to be received, but as something to be explored. I was no longer simply listening to physics. I was doing physics with other people. And that changed everything. I began to see that knowledge is not a collection of finished objects placed on a shelf. Knowledge is alive. It is made. It is tested. It is questioned. It is argued over. It is revised. It is something wrong. And when you participate in that process, when you become part of the making of knowledge, curiosity comes back to life. That was one of the most important lessons of my life. education can kill curiosity, but education can also fuel it. Graduates, many of you came to MEF with plans. Some of those plans have already changed. More will change. That is not a sign that something has gone wrong. A plan is useful. It gives you direction. But life has a way of offering possibilities we could not have imagined in advance. So yes, have a plan, but stay open to the unexpected. The second lesson is about learning and about an assumption I had to unlearn. I used to believe that if something is taught clearly, students would learn it. Later, I discovered how wrong that was. The second lesson is this: never confuse being taught with learning. I learned this lesson in an embarrassing way by becoming a professor and doing exactly what my own professors had done. But before that could happen, another plan had to fail. In graduate school, I decided that I was never, ever going to become a professor. Both of my parents were academics. I loved them, I respected them, but like many young people, I wanted to be different from my parents. So I lined up a job at Philips, the Dutch electronics company. To me, it seemed like the perfect path. I would go into industry. I would do interesting and useful work. I would not become a professor. Then my father gave me one more piece of advice. Before taking the job, why not do a one-year postdoc in the United States? As I had never been in the US, that seemed like a good one-year plan. Philips allowed me to defer, so I applied to Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and Berkeley. Given that I had my dream job at Philips, I had nothing to lose. I received several offers, including one from Harvard. So in early 1982, I left Europe to go to Harvard for 1 year. And what can I tell you? It has been a very long year. Once again, the plan failed. I became the very thing I had promised myself I would never become: a professor. And not just anywhere, a professor at Harvard. That unexpected turn opened a life I could not have designed in advance. New fields of research, new ways of thinking about education, discoveries I could not have predicted, and eventually startups I certainly had not imagined. That may sound impressive, but here's another confession. When I first started teaching, I taught in exactly the same way that had failed me as a student. I lectured. Clearly, I thought. Enthusiastically, I hoped. I prepared carefully. My students took notes. They nodded. They did well on exams. They even gave me good evaluations. And I thought, this is working. Then I discovered that it was not. When I asked students conceptual questions, questions that required them to reason rather than simply reproduce procedures, I found that many of them did not really understand the physics. They could solve problems. They could manipulate equations. They could get correct answers. But they did not necessarily understand what those answers meant. That was my aha moment. Not the student's aha moment, mine. I realized that the person doing the most thinking in my classroom was me. I was explaining. I was organizing. I was connecting ideas. I was making sense of the material. And the students were watching me do it. This is a very common mistake in education. We confuse teaching with learning. We assume that if something has been clearly explained, it has been learned. We assume that if students have heard the answer, they own the understanding. But understanding cannot be transferred. It must be constructed by the learner. So I stopped asking, how can I explain this better? And started asking, how can I make my students think? That question led to peer instruction and to what many people now call flipped learning. The first encounter with information does not need to happen in the classroom. So in the classroom, instead of lecturing, I began asking conceptual questions. Students would think individually and commit to an answer. Then they would turn to a neighbor and try to convince one another. The room changed. The energy changed. The learning changed. Suddenly, students were not passive recipients. They were active participants. They were arguing. They were explaining. They were listening. They were reconsidering. And frequently experiencing that beautiful moment when confusion gives way to understanding. The aha moment. That moment is addictive. Once you see it, you want to create the conditions for it over and over again. That is why MEF's commitment to flipped learning matters. Not because flipped is fashionable, and not because technology transforms education by itself. It does not. It is easy to record lectures and move them online and pretend education has been transformed. But old wine in new bottles is still old wine. The real transformation is not where the lecture happens. The real transformation is who owns the learning. You know from experience that active learning is not always easy. It asks more of you. It can be uncomfortable. It asks you to prepare, to participate, to reveal what you do not yet understand, and to think before you feel ready to think. But that discomfort is not a flaw. It is the point. Learning is not the same as being comfortable. Growth rarely is. Why else do we talk about growing pains? A university that challenges you to think, to question, to work with others, to apply knowledge, to confront uncertainty, and to take responsibility for your learning is giving you something far more valuable than information. It gives you agency. And that is the second lesson I hope you will carry with you. Never confuse being taught with learning. A university can offer you a curriculum. A teacher can explain. A classmate can challenge your thinking, but understanding is something you must build for yourself. And that is what you have practiced at MEF. And that brings us to the world you are entering. If learning merely meant receiving information, then perhaps the future would belong to machines. But if learning means asking, judging, testing, revising, and taking responsibility, then the future still belongs to human beings who know how to learn. The third lesson is this. Now, more than ever, in the age of AI, your questions matter more than your answers. You graduate at a strange and remarkable moment. For much of human history, education was built around scarcity, scarce book, scarce teachers, scarce information, scarce access. Now we face the opposite problem. Information is no longer scarce. Answers are no longer scarce. Artificial intelligence will make them even more abundant. I know that for you, graduates, AI does not feel like an exciting abstraction. It raises questions about work, about creativity, fairness, and the value of what you have spent years learning. I share your concerns. Those concerns are precisely why judgment matters. And the question is not whether AI will produce answers. It will. The question is whether we will know how to judge them. You will work in a world where machines can write, translate, summarize, code, design, analyze, diagnose, and perhaps even discover. They will produce answers instantly, confidently, and at enormous scale. This is extraordinary. It is also dangerous because the abundance of answers does not eliminate the need for education. It changes what education is for, and it makes the education you received more important, not less. If answers are everywhere, then the most important human skill is not merely producing answers. It is asking better questions. It is knowing when an answer is shallow. It is recognizing when something important has been left out. It is asking, is this true? Is this fair? Is this wise? Who benefits? Who is harmed? What assumptions are hidden here? What questions should we have asked instead? That is why the idea behind MEF's artificial intelligence competency requirement matters. Not because every student must become a computer scientist. Not because artificial intelligence is magic. Not because technology by itself will save education. It will not. But because every educated person now needs to understand how to live and work with systems that can generate answers without understanding truth, meaning, context, or consequence. AI can give you a response. It cannot give you judgment. AI can generate possibilities. It cannot decide what kind of human being you should become. AI can imitate thought. It cannot take responsibility. That responsibility remains yours. And that is why ownership of learning matters now more than ever. If education trains you merely to repeat answers or follow procedures, AI will do those things faster and tirelessly. But if education trains you to ask why, to think with others, to challenge assumptions, to revise your thinking, and to act with judgment, then you are not being replaced. You are being called upon to become more fully human. The most important thing, the most important question in the age of AI may be the oldest question of childhood. Why? Children ask it constantly. Why is the sky blue? Why do stars shine? Why do people fight? Why? And then, all too frequently, education trains the question out of them. It rewards the right answer more than the deep question. It rewards speed more than thoughtfulness. It rewards performance more than understanding. It rewards compliance more than curiosity. Active learning tries to bring the question back. That, to me, is the point of active learning. So, graduates, as you leave this university, do not think of your education as complete. Think of it as activated. Your diploma does not say, I am done learning. It says, I know how to learn. In a world overflowing with answers, do not surrender your questions. Ask why. Ask what matters. Ask who benefits. Ask what is missing. In the age of AI, your questions matter more than your answer. So, if you remember nothing else from my lecture, remember this. Have a plan, but stay open to the unexpected. Do not surrender your understanding, and never let answers silence your questions. These three lessons are, I think, what it means to be a MEF graduate. You have learned to make plans, but not to be limited by them. You have learned that understanding is something you build, not something you receive. And you have learned that when answers are everywhere, judgment and curiosity matter even more. But there's one more thing I hope you have learned here. Learning is not a solitary act. Life is not a solitary act. A university at its best is not simply a collection of courses. It is a community of learners. We therefore have a moral obligation as educators to teach students how to work together, because almost nothing worth doing is done alone. You will carry that habit of thinking with others into companies, laboratories, schools, hospitals, public institutions, startups, families, and communities. In many of those places, you will meet people who have been trained to wait to be told what to do. Do not become one of them. Ask better questions. Invite others into the thinking. Create the conditions in which people can learn from one another. That's how education becomes more than something you received. It becomes something you give back. That idea has deep roots in this country. Nearly a century ago, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk understood that the future of a nation depends on the education of its young people. But he also understood that education could not merely be ceremonial. It could not be memorization, recitation, and obedience. Education had to prepare people to think, to build, to participate, to act. When Atatürk invited John Dewey to Turkey, he was asking a question every society must keep asking. What kind of education does the future require? Dewey's answer, in different words, was learning by doing, learning by experience, learning as participation in life. Today, MEF University, under the leadership of its founding rector, Professor Muhammad Şahin, continues to carry that vision forward. Learning by doing, learning by questioning, learning with others. That is the education you have received. And now it becomes the life you must live. I began today telling you that I always knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. It just never worked out that way. I am grateful now that it did not, because every failed plan taught me something no plan could ever have taught me, that learning is not preparation for life. Learning is how we live when life refuses to follow the script. That is what I hope you take from MEF. Not merely knowledge, not merely a diploma, but the confidence to enter an uncertain world with your curiosity intact. The courage to say, I do not know yet. The habit of asking, why? And the responsibility to keep learning, not only for yourself, but for the people and the communities whose life you will touch. That is where hope lives. Not in the plan, not in the institution, not in the technology, in the learner, in you. As Atatürk reminds us, bütün ümidim gençliktedir.
Profesör Erik Mazur'a bu unutulmaz son dersi için şükranlarımızı sunuyoruz. Atatürk'ün yıllar önce aktif öğrenme vizyonunu öngörüp Cumhuriyet'in temeline koyduğunu vurgulaması ve atamızın bütün ümidim gençliktedir sözünü bir kez daha kendisinden duymak bizler için çok kıymetliydi. Kilometrelerce uzaktan gelerek bu anlamlı günün bir parçası olduğunuz için sonsuz teşekkürler. Kendisine teşekkür etmek ve günün anısına hediyelerini takdim etmek üzere Rektörümüz Profesör Doktor Muhammed Şahin'i kürsüye davet ediyorum.